There is a number that defines our reality, yet it is so large that the human mind cannot truly comprehend it. $315 trillion, that is the total debt of the global economy. It is 3 times larger than the combined value of everything the human race produces in a year. The United States alone owes $38 trillion. Japan owes $9 trillion. Every major nation is drowning in red ink. But have you ever paused to ask the question that sits at the very center of this paradox? If every country owes money, who do they owe it to? If the entire world is in debt, where is the creditor? The answer is not what you think. It isn't aliens, and it isn't some hidden cache of gold. When you peel back the layers of the global economy, you discover a terrifying truth. The world owes money to itself. But this isn't a mistake. It isn't a glitch in the software or the result of bad politicians making careless decisions. It is a cage. This system was built. It was engineered with precision, piece by piece, over the course of 3 centuries. It was designed by 4 specific men, 4 bankers, who lived in different eras but shared a singular vision. They constructed a mechanism where debt can never be repaid, where interest flows eternally upward, and where the people who built the trap profit from every crisis, every war, and every bailout ought to understand why the $38 trillion debt isn't a crisis for the elites, but rather their greatest asset. We have to go back to the beginning. We have to look at the blueprints. Let me introduce you to the 4 architects who enslaved the world, not with chains, but with ledger entries. The first architect, William Paterson, and the invention of Perpetual. Date: the year is 1694. The location is London. At this time, the concept of national debt as we know it didn't exist. For thousands of years, if a king or a queen needed money to wage war, they had to go to wealthy merchants or nobles and beg for a loan. It was a simple transaction. The king borrowed gold. He promised to pay it back with interest by a specific date, and that was it. If the king lost the war and couldn't pay, he defaulted. The lenders lost their money. The king was humiliated, but the slate was wiped clean. Debt was temporary. It had a beginning and an end. William Paterson changed the course of human civilization because he realized that a debt that ends is bad for business. Paterson was a Scottish merchant, a man with a mind for schemes. At the time, England was exhausted. King William III was locked in a brutal war with France. The treasury was empty. The soldiers were unpaid, and the king's credit was ruined. Traditional lenders refused to give him a single coin. Paterson approached the desperate king with a proposal that sounded insane. He told the king, "I will gather a syndicate of wealthy friends, and we will lend you £1.2 million, a staggering fortune, in the 17th century. But there was a catch, a condition that had never been written into a contract before." Paterson said, "Your Majesty, you will never repay the principal. You keep the £1.2 million. You keep it forever. All we ask is that you pay us interest every single year for eternity." To facilitate this, Paterson proposed a new institution, the Bank of England. The genius of this trap was subtle but devastating. The merchants deposited their gold into the bank. The bank lent it to the government. The government taxed the citizens to pay the interest, and the bank took that tax money and distributed it to the merchants. For the king, it was free money up front. For Paterson and his circle, it was something far more valuable, a guaranteed income stream backed by the violence of the state. As long as the government could tax its peasants, the investors would get their 8%. They had turned the government into an annuity machine. But Paterson didn't stop there. He added the clause that became the foundation of modern inflation. He ensured the Bank of England had the right to issue paper notes backed by the king's debt. Suddenly, debt wasn't just a burden. Debt was money. The more the king borrowed, the more paper money the bank could print and circulate. In 1694, the charter was signed. The debt became permanent. The principal was never meant to be repaid, and the blueprint was set. The government borrows, the people pay the interest through taxes, and the bankers keep the spread. The second architect, Nathan Rothschild, and the global web Paterson created the engine, but it was limited to one country. It took another man, more than a century later, to turn this engine into a global weapon. By the early 1800s, the Napoleonic Wars were tearing Europe apart. Governments were desperate for cash, but the market for their debt was clumsy and slow. Enter the House of Rothschild. The Rothschild family had established a unique banking dynasty, with 5 brothers positioned in the 5 great capitals of Europe: London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples. They created the first information They had private couriers, fast boats, and carrier pigeons that allowed them to move information and gold faster than any government. Nathan Rothschild, stationed in London, was the mastermind. He didn't just want to lend to the British government, he wanted to own the market for government debt. His moment of absolute victory came in 1815, at the Battle of Waterloo. The story is legendary for a reason. Nathan's spy network brought him news of Napoleon's defeat, a full day before the official messengers reached London. Possessing this knowledge, Nathan went to the London Stock Exchange. He didn't buy, he started selling British bonds aggressively. The other traders, seeing the most powerful banker in the world selling, assumed he knew something they didn't. They assumed Britain had lost the war. Panic swept the floor. Everyone sold. The price of British government debt collapsed to pennies. Then, at the last moment, Nathan reversed course. He bought everything. When the real news arrived the next day that Britain had won, the prices skyrocketed. In a single afternoon, Nathan Rothschild multiplied his fortune and effectively became the creditor of the British Empire. But his true innovation wasn't a trade, it was the structure he built afterward. Rothschild industrialized sovereign debt. He created the bond market. Before this, a loan was a personal deal between a king and a banker. Nathan turned debt into a product that could be bought and sold by anyone, anywhere. He sold British government debt to investors in France. He sold Austrian debt to investors in Britain. Why does this matter? Because it made the trap inescapable. If a country tried to default, they weren't just stiffing one banker. They were crashing the pension funds and savings of the entire continent. Rothschild created a system of mutually assured destruction for finance. No government could escape the debt because the debt was everywhere. It was the bloodstream of the global economy. By the mid-19th century, the Rothschild model was dominant. International debt, traded globally, impossible to default on without destroying civilization. The third architect, J.P. Morgan, and the infinite printer. By the dawn of the 20th century, the system had a problem. It was still tethered to reality. There was only so much gold in the world, which meant there was a limit to how much money banks could lend and how much debt governments could issue. The bankers needed a way to remove the limits. They needed a mechanism to create money out of thin air, to buy the debt they were issuing. This brings us to the third architect, J.P. Morgan, America. In the early 1900s was an economic giant with a primitive banking system. There was no central bank. Americans didn't trust them. They viewed central banks as tools of European tyranny. J.P. Morgan, the most powerful banker in America, knew he had to change this perception. In 1907, a terrible financial panic gripped New York. Banks were collapsing. The stock market froze. J.P. Morgan stepped in as the savior. He locked the leading bankers in his library on Madison Avenue and forced them to pool their resources to bail out the system. He saved the economy, but he used the crisis to sell a lie. The lie was that the banking system was too fragile to survive without a lender of last resort. Morgan and his associates, the Rockefellers, the Warburgs, decided they needed a central bank, but they couldn't call it that. It was too unpopular. So, in November 1910, a group of the most powerful men in the world boarded a private train car with blinds drawn. They traveled to Jekyll Island, off the coast of Georgia, for a duck hunting trip. For 9 days, in absolute secrecy, they wrote the legislation for the Federal Reserve. They were brilliant at branding. They didn't call it a central bank. They called it the Federal Reserve System. It sounded governmental. It sounded safe. They designed it with regional branches to make it look decentralized. But make no mistake, the power lay in New York, and the ownership lay with the private banks. Passed continuously just before Christmas in 1913, when most of Congress was absent or distracted, the Federal Reserve Act completed the trap. Here is the mechanism. Morgan and his peers unlocked. The Federal Reserve has the power to purchase U.S. government debt with money it creates from nothing. Before this, if the U.S. government wanted to borrow $1 billion, someone had to have saved $1 billion to lend it. After 1913, if the government needed money, the Fed simply typed numbers into a ledger, created the cash, and bought the bonds. This closed the circle. The government could borrow forever because the Fed would always be there to buy the debt. The constraints of gold and savings were removed. The age of infinite money, therefore infinite debt, had begun. The fourth architect, Paul Volcker, and the weaponization of insolvency. There was one final lock to place on the cage. By the 1970s, the system was global. Developing nations in Latin America, Asia, and Africa had been encouraged to borrow massive amounts of cheap dollars to build infrastructure. But in the late 70s, inflation threatened the US dollar. Enter Paul Volcker, the chairman of the Federal Reserve. To save the dollar, Volcker did something drastic. In 1979, he raised interest rates to the sky, peaking at 20%. It worked to stop inflation in America, but it detonated a bomb in the developing world. Countries that had borrowed money at 5% interest suddenly had to refinance at 20%. It was mathematically impossible. Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, they were all bankrupt overnight. In a free market, these countries would have the banks that lent them the money recklessly would have taken the loss. That is how capitalism is supposed to work. But working with the IMF, International Monetary Fund, introduced the final innovation, restructuring. Instead of allowing Mexico to default and clear the debt, the system said, "No, we will lend you the money to pay the interest you owe us." It sounds absurd, lending someone money to pay you back, but it wasn't an act of charity. It was a purchase of sovereignty. In exchange for these new loans, the IMF demanded structural adjustments. Mexico had to sell off its state-owned industries to foreign investors. They had to cut spending on their own people. They had to orient their entire economy toward exports to pay the debt. Volcker proved that a debt that cannot be paid is the ultimate tool of control. The goal wasn't to get the money back. The goal was to keep the debt active forever, ensuring that the resources of the global south flowed continuously to the banks of the north. The debt was no longer just a financial instrument. It was a political leash that the modern machine saw. Here we are today. The structure is complete. We have Paterson's perpetual interest, ensuring the principal is never paid. We have Rothschild's global web, ensuring that no one can escape without crashing the world. We have Morgan's Federal Reserve, ensuring the money supply can always expand to cover new debt. And we have Volcker's restructuring, ensuring that even bankruptcy is just an opportunity for more control. This is why $38 trillion of US debt is not a problem that the government is trying to fix. It is the system working exactly as designed. When the government issues a bond, the financial system gets a safe asset. When the Federal Reserve buys that bond, the money supply expands, inflating the prices of stocks and real estate owned by the wealthy. When the taxpayers pay interest on that debt, wealth is transferred from the working class to the asset-holding class. It is a perfectly sealed ecosystem. The $315 trillion in global debt represents a claim on the future labor of every human being on Earth. Every dollar of debt is someone else's asset. If the debt were paid off, the assets of the super-rich would vanish, the money supply would shrink, the system would stop. They will not let that happen. The architects are long dead, but the machine they built is running faster than ever. It doesn't matter who is president. It doesn't matter which party is in power. The math dictates the policy. The debt must grow, the interest must be paid, and the transfer of wealth must continue. Understanding this is the only way to make sense of the world. Once you see the blueprints, you realize that we aren't living in a broken economy. We are living in a highly efficient, perfectly engineered extraction machine. The question is no longer how do we pay it back. The question is, how long can the machine run before the gears grind to a halt?